How's everyone doing? Excellent. This is all just a warm-up act to the IGF Awards and the Developers' Choice Awards, so you can be finishing your betting pools and all that while we're doing this. So, finding the spark. This is a talk I've been wanting to give here for a while. Perfect, beautiful timing. I love it. I will commence bragging about my two wonderful compatriots here in a minute, but I wanted to give kind of an overview of what the point of this talk is. So many times when I come to GDC, and especially like today was a perfect example of witnessing this in the demo derby, time and time again we hear, or people send me reels and things like that to check out and give feedback on, where I think, oh, this would have been amazing if it was just a little bit more live sounding. And I don't really mean by that produce your samples better. I mean, if you can't hire a full orchestra, if you're writing orchestral music, and you can't hire a full orchestra, why not start scaling back until you are at something that you can afford, even if that means like a flute or an oboe or a cello or something like that. And then I realized, just from sort of talking to folks and exploring that subject, that there's a lot of people that that's actually kind of a big mountain to climb if they've never done it before. So my goal today is not to talk about technique. My goal is not to talk about orchestration. It is 100% to kind of hopefully demystify the whole process of working with musicians and to just make it abundantly clear how very doable it is and how much it will benefit you in a very non-threatening and actually really wonderful and fun kind of way. So I'm really not going to be getting into kind of technique and technical kind of conversation. So I'm going to just speak a little bit in some generalities, and then we're going to have sort of a conversation, and then they're actually going to read some music that came from you guys, and I hope everyone's here whose music I chose. And then I'm trying to go through it as quickly as I can so that we have a longer than normal span for Q&A afterwards, because I really, 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 really want you guys to ask them questions, because these are two of the best of the best of the best musicians, and you aren't paying for them to be here, which means now is an amazing chance for you to ask all those things that you might be hesitant to ask when it's on your dime. And so I just really want you to take full advantage of that, and I'm building extra time to do it. And so start thinking, because that really to me is going to be what makes this valuable, is them addressing your concerns. And so part of this also is I'm not actually advocating for live recording. I am operating under the assumption that you already want to do that. So if there's anyone here who has some like weird anti-musician agenda, this is not for you today. My assumption is that you haven't done it much, or you've never done it at all. Actually, I am curious. Is there anyone here who feels like, or who has never had the opportunity or taken the chance to work with actual live players on your projects? And please be honest, because the more hands, the better, actually. Good. I like that. I like that there are, and how many of you, it's not the norm? Your default is probably going to be using samples for things. Okay, perfect. Again, the main focus is going to be in the dynamic, because it's not just about putting a microphone in front of somebody and saying, okay, play this. Here are notes on a page. Make them sound from this thing in your hands. It's about talking to them and recognizing and remembering the fact, and I know this probably sounds super weird to have to remind you, but you are a person and they are also people. And so the way you treat each other and the way you interact is actually going to directly impact the performance. And the thing that I always try to remind fellow composers and like the game directors and audio directors and people that we work with is that no one has ever actually heard a piece of music that a composer wrote. You have only ever heard a musician's performance of a piece of music a composer wrote, which means that they are more than just a sound-making object. They are literally you after you've recorded it. And so treating that process with a lot of love and respect and really trying to figure out ways to maximize it so that they give you the best performance that they've ever given is, to me, really what I'm trying to uncover here today. So again, it's not really about orchestration. It's not really about like copyist errors and proofreading parts and all that. We will touch on those things. But we're really here to talk about music in a much more touchy-feely sort of way. I chose the two instruments that I did because I find that they're probably two of the most trackable. They scale really, really well. So, any lessons learned here today would apply, I think, to a full orchestra. But also, the number of times that I've recorded just solo cello and just solo flute is vastly beyond. And part of that's obviously just my own sort of subjective taste as a composer. But it really outweighs, for me, relative to basically any other two instruments. And so I just find that, if you don't have a great mic and if you don't have great preamps, and it's just basically some like $100 mic going by USB into a laptop, putting that in front of these instruments can still sound really amazing. And so I find that from the spectrum of sweetening through to big full scoring stages, they kind of serve as the best sort of general examples. So of course I have to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. Aren't samples just going to eventually replace all live players? I think that my stance on that was probably obvious before I asked the question. But I did want to sort of think about that question for a moment to kind of give a sense of why I think it's important to talk about this subject. Because I think there's been a sort of convergence of several parallel tracks in the history of game music that are fascinating, that have gotten us to where we are, and why so many of your hands went up when I said, who here, doesn't regularly work with live players. Obviously, the first sort of many years of the game industry, the games themselves, from a hardware and software standpoint, couldn't actually support playing back recorded performances of music. Everything started off as, very sort of what we would think of by today's standards, sort of clunky hardware-based music. It's actually very elegant and beautiful in its way, but relative to what they do and to the type of emotional aim that you would have with hiring a player like them, it was nowhere near as nuanced, as incredibly nuanced as it was. And so you had decades of gamers growing very accustomed to hearing those sound. That was the sound of game music itself. You think of the early arcade games and early home console games. That particular, these, what we now call chip tunes, were synonymous with just the term game music. And so in addition to the fact that you have a huge audience of gamers being born that have fueled the economy that has let all of us be in this room, where that was what was normal for them, you had composers as a subset of that audience who were growing up and they would play a game and say, I want to do that for a living. I want to write music for games. And their benchmark for what normal game music sounded was also this particular palette in which they were not hearing live instruments, which is distinctly different from, say, people that grew up listening to film scores and said, I want to go work in Hollywood and do film scores, because no matter how far back you go in the history of film music, they were always hearing live performances of live orchestras. That was normal to them. If you grew up playing games in the first sort of couple of hardware generations, for several hardware generations of the game industry, that was not your definition of normal, especially if you were so obsessed with it that you didn't really listen to classical music or bands or film music or whatever else where people are actually sort of performing. In addition to those facts, the cost of making a viable game has gotten very inexpensive over the last year. Interestingly, AAAs have only gotten more expensive, but in the indie space, for example, someone can make a game for nothing and become a millionaire from it. So the economy has become very facile and very interesting, and as a result, there is no assumption of a lot of production budget available to you. And in addition to that, the cost of sample libraries and sort of home prosumer or low-cost professional sampling software and those kinds of things has also gotten comparatively really cheap. So we have basically this convergence of these histories of people who can make orchestral-sounding stuff that is actually foreign to what they grew up listening to, really low cost, and on games where there's no assumption of them being able to afford to pay for these kinds of things to begin with. And on top of that, the vast swath of gamers that grew up playing those same games aren't exactly clamoring to hear live orchestras either, because their benchmark for normal was a couple of decades of hearing these hardware-based sounds. So, in other words, you don't necessarily... I'm not surprised, in other words, that as many hands went up as they did, because I feel like that's just the way that the history has pointed us to. But, like I said, to be clear, I still operate under the assumption that if you are writing for an instrument, recording that instrument is always better, period. If you're doing electronic music, then you're doing electronic music. That's a separate category, and that's not really what I'm talking about here today, which, as a side note, I love and I think is totally awesome. But if you are writing a cello line, and you're using, as much as, the Blackest cello is an awesome sample, or, you can isolate your section leaders in LAS, it's not the same as putting it in front of a real person. And so, as an example of even just the power of sweetening, I want to play you something that you may have heard before. So for this, when asking yourself, what is the point? Why put parts in front of a player? In my mind, that sound is simply not doable any other way. And part of why it's not doable any other way is that it's written to the personality of the musician playing. It's beautifully coincidental that, of course, this piece features a cello, flute, and bass flute, but still. And obviously this is from Journey, in case you didn't know. But the reason why I'm playing this is because this is actually the very first piece of music that I wrote for the game, which was on day one of the project. So the strings that you hear, this was never commercially released because the strings here are samples. That's why I turned to him and said, what an amazing plug for my talk tonight. Because here, no one has ever noticed that the trailer released for this game has a giant sampled string orchestra in the back of it, because you can't help but obsessively listen to Tina Guo playing the cello. And so it's like, even with just one person, everyone automatically thinks, wow, this was really produced well. And it was literally a microphone going straight into an 828, Motu 828. There's absolutely no frills happening there. And just for a side-by-side comparison, in case your takeaway from that is, oh, great, so there's never any reason to record live strings, here's the comparison of the final version, which is the same exact performance, including the cello, but 2.5 years later we replaced the strings with an actual string orchestra. I never make any claims about whether that's actually good music, good writing, or whatever, but I can tell you it is good performance. And when you hear good performance, it's pretty hard to not feel like this must therefore be good music. It's really hard to hear a performer play something with conviction and passion and then be turned off by it, I find. I want to use another example from the Banner Saga, which I was talking about yesterday. because this actually this is kind of a more nuanced point. But when I was recording these violin solos, I told her, play on an older, cheap violin that you had practiced on as a kid, and also give a little tweak to the tuning peg so it's a little janky, because that's the rustic sort of raw sound that I want. And that's an example of a kind of thing that to try to even remotely attempt that with samples is like 9 hours of programming, and it will sound like shit at the end. Whereas with her, I just said, will you do this? And 3 seconds later, it sounded like what you just heard. And so, you know, again, I know I'm kind of making a little bit of a sales pitch here, whereas I began by saying I don't feel like I need to make this sales pitch, but hopefully for anyone who feels very comfortable just living in their world of their samples, all I'm trying to get across by saying all of this and by playing these audio clips is that I think that you can always go further. You can always push it more deeply, and that people, you know, gamers and your collaborators both will respond to it better, and it's really not a difficult process. The amount of nuance that you get is astounding. So I want to talk just a little bit about some classic mistakes, because what I have found is that I think the biggest contributor to the reason why this is kind of an intimidating process to a lot of people is that what happens is, being a composer naturally already kind of plays on our ingrained sense of insecurity. It's like, to be a composer, you already have to be kind of a neurotic and unhealthy person, and to then put yourself in front of musicians who have been doing this all their life and who are super experts is like a really kind of horrifying thought for a lot of people, because you can't help but think, if I put a part down in front of them and they who are used to playing, you know, the Dvorak cello concerto or fill in the blank, you know, the Chris Rouse flute concerto, and then I put my little piece of crap in front of them, they're going to be like, what is this? You know, can we play some real music? I think we all have that fear, and which of course forgets the fundamental psychology that from their perspective, people will hear them play. It's actually, they want to play really beautifully also. It's not like this weird antagonistic relationship. But I think that because we're just so naturally predisposed towards that insecurity, we walk into it just afraid of what everybody thinks. And so what ends up happening is that if something is not quite right, or something's not, not gelling, or there's a question or whatever, what I see time and again, like when I go to the ASCAP workshop, for example, and I see composers up in front of an orchestra of phenomenal musicians on like the Warner Brothers scoring stage, where these people can do anything, and then there's a moment, there's a mistake, the composer goes through this chain reaction of thinking, if they're such great players, why is there a mistake? And then suddenly they're mad at the orchestra when I'm like, hey man, there was a missing flat in your parts, and they wanted to ask about it. But you're just already hopelessly down this rabbit hole of thinking, they are ruining my music. And I think that if we just, first off, realize that that's never the case, we can productively address some of these sort of classic things that will come up. So the first one I want to mention, I'm just going to kind of blast through these so I can start letting them actually talk. We have a tendency, especially when we're really used to using our samples, to write to their strengths. And I always brag about how shitty my mock-ups sound, because I was very lucky to grow up in high school conducting my high school orchestra, and that's kind of what formed a lot of my understanding of how to write for an orchestra. And so I have a tendency to write things that the samples are not necessarily sort of happy to accommodate. And then I end up just sort of saying, screw it, I'm going to record it later anyway. And, sometimes that really bites me in the ass, and that's a problem I've yet to quite figure out the solution to. But the point being, usually what you see is without a background like that, there tends to be the opposite, which is why, for example, we see lots and lots and lots and lots of very kind of Hans Zimmer-esque, trailer music-esque things, because real short, punchy articulations are very easy to sample, and samples sound good doing them. And so people tend to write to the strengths of their samples. Now, if you're doing a job where they're not going to hire a live orchestra, that's probably a pretty smart thing to do, because this is going to be the final version of that music. But if you're going to be recording, if you're going to have a live orchestra, just keep in mind and don't lose sight of the fact that samples have certain strengths. by virtue of the way the technology works. And every year the list of their weaknesses gets smaller as people get more and more clever in the way they learn to script their contact instruments and things like that. But the bottom line is, when you write to the sample's strengths, it's not necessarily what the actual instruments are going to be strong at doing. And as jumping off from that, the thing to remember is that I'm actually going to quote from a composer friend of mine who I thought he said it. I was brainstorming with him about this talk, and he actually said it so beautifully that I'm just going to quote him. His name is Jeremy Howard Beck. He's a concert composer principally, and he said that most mistakes come from thinking of the instruments as sound generators and not objects being played by a person, which I thought was just, I couldn't have put it more succinctly and more exactly, that you have to think of what is the physical positioning required with this object? How are they actually interacting with it with their body? Samples don't care about that because they spend 3 hours getting that perfect Marcato E-flat, and then it exists in a vacuum from there on for the rest of time. But a musician is moving from one note to the next, and they're breathing, and they are being a person. And so it's because we just spend so much time in front of our computers, it's actually incredibly easy to forget that fact. And so the easiest advice is literally just go on YouTube and just watch people play these things, because you'll have an entirely new appreciation. And I know this sounds very rudimentary, and I hope it doesn't sound like I am sort of condescending or talking down to you, because I know that, you know, basically everyone in this room is extremely talented and qualified as composers. But when you get into this certain mindset, you have a tendency to lock into these habits. And so I'm just trying to help avoid these frustrations that come from working in sessions. Another one, this is just a kind of a nitpicky point, but we have a tendency, I think, as a result of our general insecurity over the vitality of the music, to overmark the hell out of our parts. And so musicians look, and it's like the machine from Contact on their page, where it takes a lot of deciphering. And of course, you also see the opposite problem of there being nothing there. And so it's like, well, look, I can play those notes, but that doesn't actually tell me anything about what you're trying to achieve. And so, and I wish there was an obvious answer that I could give to that, but know that tendency to overmark is what I see, and don't do it. And also just things that are not possible. You know, people have, again, because samples can do anything, there are all kinds of super awkward things that you end up asking musicians to do, forgetting, like, okay, if I ask the cellist to play those two notes, that requires that their hand be like 18 inches in its span. And even then, they got to jump over 3 strings and somehow bow missing one of those. And you know, but the samples, you do that, and holy hell, that sounded pretty good. And so, you know, and it's really awful when, you know, when you make a mistake like that, and then they say, well, you know, I just want to say this isn't actually really possible. And you say, well, what do you mean it's not possible? I thought I hired a professional. And suddenly you're in this weird place that no one wants to be. Another one that also samples have a tendency to really deceive us on is the natural dynamic tendencies of the instruments. You know, some instruments play really quietly in their bottom range and really loud in their top range, or vice versa, et cetera, et cetera. They all have natural kind of personalities and behaviors. But samples have somehow, even though samples are recordings of actual instruments, we, you know, like you hear, like fortissimo low C on flute. And you're like, I'm sorry, but they don't really do that. They can give it their might, but it just doesn't really do that. And especially if you're talking about an orchestral setting, you got a big scoring stage, and you're saying, like, flute, I need more. And there's, you know, I don't know what to tell you. You're writing me, you know, you're clobbered by every other person in the orchestra, but samples let you get away with that, obviously. And so, again, I think the best solution there is just simply actually listening. And then, of course, engaging with the players is what we're going to get to now. So let me tell you a little bit about these people. First off, how did you say your last name?
Oh, me, Jokic.
Jokic.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Michelle Jokic. I'm just going to read a little bit of sort of bragging about these incredible musicians I feel very grateful to have up here with me. Michelle is the founder and artistic director of the Concordia Chamber Players. And I'm paraphrasing. These bios are way too elaborate for it would be the rest of our talk if I were to try to incorporate it all. So my paraphrased version of these bios founder and artistic director of the Concordia Chamber Players, and just generally extremely passionate about chamber music, which that should be a little thing that you notice for when you're talking about sweetening and people who are used to working in intimate settings. That should just be something that you notice. Debuts as a soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra at age 12, and received both bachelor's and master's from the Juilliard School. Stephanie, a former Angelino from a rather esteemed musician family, has previously worked with basically you name them: John Williams, Alan Silvestri, Marco Beltrami. Currently plays piccolo at San Francisco Opera, previously Buffalo Philharmonic, New Mexico Symphony, Long Beach Symphony, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I don't want to take us down the path of otherwise very righteous bragging about these two. So I think this is kind of my favorite picture ever. Anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I'm always about 1 second away from talking about cats. So as a composer or producer in a session environment, you are obviously the leader. But as with other kind of leadership dynamics, being this iron-fisted sort of dictator will encounter the same kind of issues that actual sort of iron-fisted dictators are going to encounter. And so I think creating the right atmosphere is of absolute most paramount importance. You cannot be harsh and overly critical, but at the same time, if you are sort of weak and unopinionated, you're not going to get as good a performance. You're going to afterward think, I don't understand why this isn't all that it can be. So basically, the single most useful tip, and the reason why I have that picture there, is because for what I always end up doing is constantly asking the musicians, what do you think? What is your opinion? As you read the music, as you know how these notes are going to fall under your hands and out of your lungs, what do you think is the solution to whatever we have at hand here? Or how would you do it? Because you get questions all the time about a lot of the details. Should this phrase, stop here and then I breathe there and then begin here? Or should we break it up in half of that? And I say, well, if we did that, and if I say that this measure is, I think, the most important one, what's going to let you act on that the most? And they will have an answer. And I'm always constantly asking the musicians because like I said before, they are the music, which therefore they are me in this performance forevermore. I think the reason why we don't tend to ask a lot of questions is because we have this fear that it's somehow a poor reflection on our music if they have thoughts on how to make it better that we didn't have. I have some other specifics, but in the interest of time, I'll come back to them later. Just one real quick, sort of hopefully practical detail. Here's just a few I'm going to just run through really fast. I find that sometimes when people are insecure at sessions, especially in orchestral context, I see a lot of composers and music producer types giving notes because they can. And just saying, because it feels like, oh, maybe I'm being unopinionated and weak if I don't give notes on a section. And don't do that. I see it all the time where it's like, oh, it could be, I don't know. Maybe it was a little flat. And it's like, dude, it was fine. It sounded fantastic, actually. And so just keep yourself in check. No one's questioning your intelligence if after one take you say, you know what, that was awesome. Let's move on. Also, this is, again, very sort of pragmatic, but put a lot of thought into what your recording order is going to be. Because you want a nice sort of emotional ebb and flow so that, the very first thing at 10 in the morning shouldn't be something incredibly mind-numbingly difficult. But at the same time, nor should it be like 40 bars of whole notes. And so really try to think in terms of almost telling a story and creating a dramatic arc that's going to continuously have interest within the recording order that you try to create, because that will directly impact the quality of performances that you're going to get. And nothing is worse than if you happen to have a thing where it's just all like long footballs, whole notes, just endless. Like that is just a nightmare. It's probably even worse for you guys than it is.
Seen it a lot.
Yeah, it can be hard. And again, I've already kind of harped on this, but they're there to help you. It's their performances people are going to be hearing, and we get worked up in this kind of antagonistic relationship when we are fearful, but that's actually false. That's just our insecurities bubbling up. As a continuation of the recording order, another one is vary your recording rhythm. But what I mean by that is sometimes we do a take, and then I have sort of I'll turn to the concertmaster, or if it's a tracking situation, I turn and I say, okay, I want to ask you about these following 5 things about that, et cetera, we talk about it. Then we go back, we do another take, and before they've even finished taking a breath, they say, okay, back to bar 1, and we go straight back into it again without even hesitating. And then we do that again, and then we stop, and then we talk about it again. And there's not a ultra predictable sort of pattern, but it's constantly varied. It just adds energy. It adds a sense of excitement, if nothing else, but it also just lets you not sort of settle in. And my obsession over, I don't know when I've transitioned from being in a groove to being in a rut, and this helps prevent that. And I know this one might sound a little bit sort of stupid and, again, remedial, but don't forget that these are people, and periodically just say simple things like, can I get you some water? Are you good? In fact, to that end,
Oh,
I have water.
thank you. We so appreciate it. That's true.
I mean, I remember once I was at one of James Horner's sessions for Avatar, 110-piece orchestra that are just wailing away. And in the middle of it, and they were doing like the big, ridiculous, complicated battle music from the end of the film. And at one point he just stops, and then there's this pause. He always has very kind of elaborate pauses in his sessions. And then he just turns to the French horns. There were 8 of them playing antiphonally across the orchestra to each other. And he just said, he kept, of course, talking to the principal horn, who's over here. And at one point he just turns to horns, 5, 6, 7, 8, and says, how are you guys doing? Right, no one's paying attention to you right now because he keeps talking to the principal, right? And he just said, how are you? And they're like, yeah, we're good. He's like, okay, let's do another one. That was it. It injects so much sort of love and energy into the room. And for those 4 players to know he actually remembers that we're here and we're busting our ass for him improves performance dramatically. All of which can be summarized in make it fun. Just remember, you're making music. This is the single most awesome thing we could ever do with our lives. It shouldn't be the most stressful part of the project. It should be the least stressful part of the project. It's the part that all the bullshit that you endure up to that point is paying off now in this moment. And so it's the thing to stress out about the least. I even go an extra mile with that in a lot of my sessions, and I bring like trivia and like gift cards, and we like play games in between cues just so that we're all having a good time. I once went way over the top with that, by the way, and I was doing a film that had the word captain in the title, and so I decided to put captain-isms all through the scoring stage and never said anything about it. There was like a Captain and Tennille LP on one wall, and at one of the parts I had my copyist add like a photo of Jean-Luc Picard, like just randomly on one of the cues. And then in the middle of the day, I just suddenly stopped and said, who can name all 10, or like something like just who can name the most number of captains that they've seen today? And suddenly there was this scramble in the orchestra and everybody looking around, and we have fun. And then, it's like that next downbeat, everyone's sort of feeling alive and we actually have fun and the performances sound fantastic. So, okay, enough out of me. I've belabored this far too much. I want to ask you guys some questions, and then I want to turn it over to you, and I want to just sort of make this conversational. So here are a few very kind of specific questions that I wanted to ask them to get their take on. So the first one is, in the larger orchestral contexts, what's basically the number one advice that you would give to composers, especially say it's their first time ever working with an orchestra in some capacity? What would be the number one advice that you would give to them to make that a successful experience? And it can be very practical, it can be very philosophical, but what is your advice?
Well, I would say that the number one piece of advice is to be efficient with the time that you have. I mean, you've made a lot of good points about preparation, but I feel like in terms of keeping the orchestra positive and on your side, really making good use of time is essential to keeping the spirit of the whole atmosphere positive.
So stopping to record to do trivia games is efficient use of time?
I would say yes.
Okay, good.
I would say yes because, I think, recording situations can be quite stressful because of the expense, number one, of having a big orchestra in front of you. It can be a lot of pressure. You're nervous about the outcome. You may have been up for 4 days straight trying to get everything done. And, the players definitely pick up on that stress, and I think it can be reflected in performance. So I think keeping things lighthearted and, just not too ultra serious is going to, get a more positive result.
You're talking about conductors, right?
Well, actually, for either. I would be curious, not every composer is necessarily going to be a conductor, but I think both insights would be valuable if you have.
Well,
if you have
in a session, time is of the essence, so that every minute is costing somebody a lot. And so I think it's essential that for the conductor to come in with a sense of confidence, but not a sense of distrust for his players or her players. And so it's the sense of coming in, they see their score and they trust that everybody in front of them is going to be completely on the mark. If they start the first cue like, everybody ready? It's going to be a failure right away. So it's the sense that you believe in your leaders, you believe in the players. One look can instill so much confidence and calm. And if it doesn't go well, no problem. Start it over again. But once you get a sense of confidence and your players feel immediately, if you trust them, you're going to get a better product in the end. If there's any suspicion of somebody not being good enough, that player will only go down faster. And then you've wasted your whole day, I think.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's beautifully said. We have a tendency to manifest our fears in those environments. But we can, by that same exact power, we can manifest what we want to have happen.
Exactly.
So then you kind of touch on another question I want to ask you, which is, what is the most helpful dynamic, whether it's the composer conducting themselves or they're in the booth and it's a separate conductor, what kind of things do you look to the conductor for? So for example, sometimes they'll get really specific right away and say, in bar 7 on beat 3, I think this should be articulated this in such and such a way. Or they might just say, I think this needs to feel light and airy, and they leave it to you. Is there one sort of strategy or another that you find more helpful? Is that too sort of circumstantial to generalize about? I mean, what's your kind of take on that?
Well, for myself, I find there are more times than not, the conductor will trust the musicians the first time through. And there's one thing that comes quite beautifully from live players is that one player might pull something out of a phrase that even the conductor or composer himself may not have anticipated being possible. So if you leave it to the artist, the performing artist, to play what's on the page and interpret it with, assuming there are tempo markings and some indication of what the emotion is supposed to be, you sometimes come out with something more than what you expected. On the other hand, if you know exactly what you want, you might inhibit the player. Because if you're too specific, this has to be short, this has to be breathed here, there's so much information. There's enough. We're only used to seeing something on the page. Most of our composers are dead. So we see the page and we internalize what we see by notes. Words sometimes get in the way of the other process.
So you're acclimated to not being able to even have that conversation.
Absolutely.
And that's actually a really brilliant point to make that I've never even thought of before. I'm so glad you said that because, yeah, that you're right. Trusting in that. One elaboration on that I'm curious if you have any response to is that very often in a recording environment, whether it's one person doing solo tracking or if it's a big full orchestra, you'll hear mistakes. And when I see younger composers that aren't used to kind of the way it tends to unfold, they'll immediately want to cite those mistakes. And after one pass, first take, they'll say, in bar 7, you played a B flat instead of a B. They probably knew that. And so very often I just say, let's just do it again. And don't try to address those things because 85% of them or more will vanish because you're sight reading.
Yeah.
Is there any more you would want to elaborate on that? Or
I think Michelle made excellent points. I think that steering away from, being too micromanagerial in those situations, you have the opportunity, you allow yourself for the opportunity for collaboration. And, essentially that's what we all got into music making for, to collaborate and communicate. So I would, I would definitely heed that advice.
Yeah, we'll usually find the wrong note the second time through, but I've often found wrong notes in the score too, so it goes both ways.
Yeah, well, and what I mean, exactly, and what I mean is sort of all different variations on that possibility.
Yeah, it's a
that
collaboration.
someone played a wrong note, but of course they knew it, and they're not going to do it the second time.
Right, and there's a difference between playing that wrong note and having that wrong note being pointed out to you in front of 75 other players when you're the first one who heard it. You did it. It can be a little counterproductive.
And I was okay. Good. I'm glad to hear that because I always for me, I like to be told when I'm wrong. I like to be told that I made a mistake, but I also don't have to regularly confront that in front of 75 other people simultaneously. And so I feel, I tend to, if for example, I remember once I had a session where I had a pair of flutes playing together, and flute 2 was just always flat. And it was one of those things that I was struggling with how the best way to address this situation was, because every single person in the orchestra, including that flautist, knew that that was the problem. But if you call them out on it and you say, Jim or Jake or whoever, you're flat here, you can actually make the problem considerably worse by making them suddenly feel so self-conscious.
Right, yeah, so I definitely think that there's an art of diplomacy to that communication, but at the same time, everyone's there to do their best. Nobody's coming in to give it 50%. So I personally appreciate direct communication. If something's not quite right, 2, 3 takes, I want to know about it.
Yeah, I want to know right away.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we can't hear, if we're listening to one thing, we can't hear if we're out of tune with the other section, if we're low cellos and the double bass.
We're working with a click track, and that limits, some part of our ability to hear across the soundstage.
Or the double basses are frequently not in tune with the cellos. Maybe it's the other way around. But I always appreciate when somebody else brings the point up and I don't have to say anything. Yeah. So it's often the conductor does actually run the show, and so if you can just make a call in a normal way, it seems like there might be some issues. Let's just check that note, we fix it, and if you bring it up, it's easier. If I were bringing it up, then all the karma's gone in our section. So
right, and it's always nice to use language that's less accusatory, as opposed to the flutes are flat. Oh, that interval sounds a little wide. Let's do it again, and that kind of puts everyone on high alert, and hopefully the problem fixes it.
No, that's I'm so glad you said that, because those kinds of specific word choices are night and day differences sometimes. I tend to speak in terms of bright and dark. I'll say, trumpets, that was maybe a bit bright, which means they were sharp. But I actually, think sometimes that is in itself part of the creative expression. Maybe you want it just a little bit slight, riding above, but you want to be able to control it. And if you just say, hey, you played sharp, there's suddenly the obsession is going to be playing intonation, focusing on intonation rather than the underlying emotional goal of the music. Mm-hmm. And, again, but this is where I tend to be the kind of touchy-feely type that likes to talk about that sort of thing. And I have had many occasions, and I'm curious if you had anything to say about this, where I am giving this elaborate explanation about why I think it should be such and such a way, and then basically I'm told, okay, look, do you want it faster? And it's okay, yeah, I probably didn't need to say all that. And so I throw that to you. I mean, is that to me that would be potentially equally kind of problematic, because it's
I would
confusing.
say that the performers in these sessions want to put out the best performance possible in the least amount of time. So the fewer words and more specifics that help us is kind of essential for us to really make it work for everybody, make it worth the while for everyone. Yeah. If we feel like it's taking way too long, your phone's really vibrating and distracting the heck out of me. But
I turned it off.
But
I guess it was because I was waiting.
No, that's been waiting for me. But I think fewer words sometimes are better, so choose your words carefully, because sometimes I'll get into a session where there's so much talking, or I just came from a rehearsal, there was so much talking that you forgot what the point of stopping was.
Yeah.
Just choose your words carefully and let's get it done.
Right, and there's a very intense focus in the recording process. Everyone wants to get it done in as few takes as possible. Right. We want to get it right the first time. So, and our breaks aren't that lengthy. We usually have 10 minutes for every 50 minutes and then an hour for lunch. So, once people's minds start to get a little bit tired, I would say less talking. I think it all comes back to using time efficiently. Sometimes you need the touchy-feely approach where we need to have an idea of the emotional content because that can help to clarify and remedy, whatever it is that you need to address. But I usually think just, short, fast, it's a little behind.
Or one word, dreamier, heavier.
Yeah.
Rougher.
Yeah.
Scarier. There are some terms you can just one word pick it and everybody will get it. We're all artists. We'll come up with it.
Couldn't say it better. Because obviously, from a pragmatic standpoint, a lot of these folks will be doing like one-on-one sessions. To what extent does all of that for you personally translate into the intimacy of it's just us in a room half the size of this stage? Because now those dynamics of like the 80-piece orchestra sitting there listening to you be judged or whatever, none of that's in play now. So is there anything that you would say different about how you like to interact in a much more intimate environment like that? Or if it's tracking like a quartet or something that's just generally much more confined?
Well, we did a string quartet recording, Quartet San Francisco up at Skywalker Studios, and was Grammy nominated for Best Classical Crossover and Best Engineering, all this stuff. And that session, we had a wave of taking turns who was having more of a presence. You have to play it very much spontaneously. And nothing's predictable. I don't think there's a formula for that type of a setting. It becomes more magnified when it's fewer people. And so at that point, there are many more possibilities, I think.
So it would be in the composer/producer's interest to be approaching that as nimbly as possible, to be able to let the session unfold.
Be extremely flexible.
Yeah,
I think so, because your demands are greater of the individual, because there's nothing backing them up. It's all on their table. And to please you is a greater desire, because
we're staring right in the eyes.
Yeah, so you have to be very flexible with that and give and take whatever's necessary at that time. Overall, I think it's the same production, but there's much more moving, there's much more emotion, individual on the performer's part that's going to come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think those are actually really nice times, because I think that you can really infuse a session with a spirit of collaboration and get a lot more from a performer when you're working one-on-one or with a quartet. And I would say a big thing, because I'm not somebody who jumps up and runs into the booth after every take, definitely invite your performers to hear what you're hearing, because often for them to be able to hear it back is more valuable than a 15-minute explanation. Like, once you hear it, oh, I see. I hear what I have to do differently now. And then you can go back and do a next pass that might be much more successful.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point that I didn't bring up at all, which I think is really, really good, which is you're especially easily able to do that in a really intimate environment where I say, let's do a pass. Now, I'd love to show you the scene that this went with, or some gameplay or whatever, and let you actually see how your performance is sitting with it, because I've had time and again, even if it's a simple thing, like cellist says, oh, this is actually a lot more sort of romantic than I realized, even just based on the music. I could, give this a little bit more of a portamento sort of slidey, romantic sort of affect that could add something, and that neither of us would have ever brought up. And so, yeah, I think inviting them into the process is going to be really, really, and just probably more interesting for you also than just staring at notes.
Yeah, I think also composers, specifically for video games, need to understand how many different colors can come out of one instrument and maximize that. Because frequently I'll get to a session and somebody says, just not scary enough. And okay, well, Ponticello maybe, and then can I hear what that sounds like? But if they come into it equipped already with a certain knowledge of what's possible of the instrument, a lot of time can be saved from our perspective as performers. If you want it at least right scary, quasi-Ponticello, or understanding what those terms mean, or really specifically say flotando or up to the fingerboard, but give us directions, because we're going to follow exactly what's written on the page. But use it. I mean, really maximize it. No vibrato, less vibrato, whatever. those type of things
Basically, no
really
such
help.
thing as too much education on the composer's part.
Yeah.
And get to know a player. You know, I haven't met a musician yet who would turn down the chance to tell you everything that they think about their instrument. So, you know, spend an afternoon, you know, listening to music, you know, find out what their recommendations for, you know, composers who have really written well for their instruments. And, you know, get to know the capabilities of the instrument. I think that that's a really good point. I mean, I think with strings, it's a little more critical because you have more variation in terms of how you're using the bow and, you know, different techniques. But I think, you know, it's just invaluable for both players and writers for you to really intimately know the capability of the instruments you're writing for.
I also like to think in terms of the personality of the musician themselves, almost like the way a casting director is casting actors. And so much so that, especially in a tracking scenario, you are essentially writing solos, even if they're sweetening your samples. I am writing for not just a flute or just a cello. It's actually for you playing that cello or that flute. And so I always find if we get lunch the day before, or ideally it's someone that I've been getting to know for years and years and years, and I can write to your personality in such a specific way that actually one of the little techniques that I really love that just starts a session off always in just the right kind of happy place is that the parts are never like this part here says flute in the corner. My part wouldn't say that. It would have your name actually written on the part because it's not, it's, you know, like in the case of Journey, for example, all the parts, there were no cello solos. There were only Tina solos. And to me, getting to know some players really do certain things really well, and they love doing them. And you can't ever find that out without just mining the depths of who they are and getting to know them and being in their company. I find that enormously informative and valuable.
Yeah, that's not the norm for us to know our composers, actually.
Well, most of them are dead.
Well, that's true. No, but good point. If not, I'll take care of it. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
We're ready.
No, but I mean, if we're called in for a session, we don't have the luxury. If you do have the luxury of knowing your musicians, by all means. But typically, I don't know that that's a familiar
I'm
situation
of course,
for us.
absolutely.
But just personally. Yeah.
But I don't think you. But correct me if I'm wrong. You wouldn't turn down the opportunity.
Absolutely not.
If someone called you and said, "I'd love to take you to lunch."
John Williams wants to know how I play. I'm more than happy.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, now because this is exactly what I was hoping to get out of this, and so I can have them do some playing of your parts, but because we're going to be running out of time here almost immediately, are there questions? Can we get you guys up here to the mics, because I think it would be more valuable for you to ask questions, because actually, to my delight, when I solicited for parts, none of them were total disasters. I was kind of hoping someone would send me a complete train wreck of a part so that we could use it as a great way to sort of have a teachable moment. And your parts were actually really solid. So at the end, it'd be fun to hear you play them. But let's take some questions with the time that we have left. So go ahead.
Hi. Most of my opportunities to record live with players have been because I don't have a budget and I do things mostly on my own. They're people that I know, they're friends that I have, and it's solo sessions. And one of the things I always like to do, because I don't consider myself that much of a composer, is that I will ask them once we're done, and I've got the things that I need, if we have time, is, okay, you know the notes, you know what feeling we're going for by now. Care to just improvise it? Just take what you have there and elongate what you think you want to elongate, or breathe through things, or just take it and go with it. And just I tend to do that at the end of most of my sessions, and I found that I get a lot of really good stuff from it because it's things I never would have thought of. But I wonder more in a more professional setting if that would be something that's appreciated or not, or in what setting maybe how I could rephrase that so it doesn't sound like I'm just pitching it to them at the end.
Yeah, good question.
Well, no, I think it's admirable. I mean, it sounds like you're really getting to know the capabilities of the instruments. I think that you need to, if you are working in a larger group setting, that you need to select your musicians accordingly. I come from primarily an orchestral background, so I don't really improvise. I'm happy to interpret. I think I do that pretty well, but improvising is not my strength, although there are wonderful players who are out there doing it.
Yeah, we're used to using a click track that is specifically designed to a game or a movie that every little moment has to be absolutely on spot. So that sort of is counterintuitive with improvisational playing, if I'm understanding you correctly. I don't know if you meant improvising on what's on the page already, or going further than that. So
usually I would already have like some synth made, like bass or drums or something to keep the time.
Yeah.
And then just the melody usually is what I would have the solo session doing, and it just sort of
yeah, no, I think I applaud you for doing it. I think you're going to come up with some really fantastic stuff if you trust the musician, the performer, to do it, especially if they're capable of taking that, and they already have an indication of what you're looking for. So I think, yeah, absolutely, especially if you found success. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I would say that is admirable, because a lot of people would be afraid to do that because they feel like, oh, maybe I didn't write it to the degree I should have, and I'm a fraud now or something. So, no, that's cool. So just in the interest of time, we'll take the next question. Thanks a lot.
Hey, so you guys had a lot of great pointers about kind of like how to navigate a live session and stuff like that, and kind of like from the composer's perspective working with live players. And so I've only had like one opportunity in my life ever to have like a piece of mine that I read by like an ensemble, and it wasn't recorded, it was just even that process of reading through a part. And so I guess like my main concern about that is like I do a lot of my stuff in the box. And so going from, it feels like when I finally will get an opportunity to work with an ensemble, it'll be in like a very high stakes situation where there's like a budget happening. I'm wondering if like, do you ever get a chance to like practice that stuff, or is it pretty much just like the only time that you're going to get to practice is when you're actually supposed to be like doing it?
If there's a string quartet part, or if there's solo parts, absolutely, I would look at it before. And I would always look at everything before. But again, that's not typically a luxury. I think if there's a big solo and somebody can warn me, it'd be great. But I often show up and there's a big solo and it's the first take of the day. Okay.
In other words, they are remarkable at handling what you throw at them, but if you can empower them even more, it's always in your interest to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think bearing that in mind, knowing that if you don't have the luxury or the relationships there to know who you're going to be working with ahead of time, because I think, if there's a big solo, you'd always appreciate looking at it ahead of time, as would I. But if you don't have that luxury, bear it in mind. I mean, when I come in and I sit down and I see just pages after pages of black notes, I think, oh my gosh, even at a very high level, not all of those notes are going to be there. And if you've got a double or even a single session to get all that stuff done in, I don't know. This might be not a super kosher thing to say, but. I mean, don't write things that are so unreadably hard that it's going to impede the artistic process.
Yeah, well, that's good practical advice. So thank you.
Yeah, because it's going to be sight read. Recently I've been watching cartoons with my 4-year-old, those old Looney Tunes, and think, those guys came in and sight read this ridiculous music. I can't even imagine. And there are people who certainly can do it and will do it very well, but it's challenging.
Okay, so the norm is to just kind of, everything's just sight read, and then you just bring it in and then boom, do it.
The norm is whatever you make it. If you as the composer say, I've got these solos and I would like to get it to whoever's leading the section who's going to be playing the solos, I would accept it, absolutely.
Yeah,
I'd appreciate it.
And if you have the opportunity to get music to players ahead of time, if you're working with a small ensemble or, you have regular people that come in and play for you, you could certainly, ask the music to be passed along if there is something really challenging, because you're going to get the best result that way.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Sir.
Hi, guys. Thanks for doing this. So I'm usually writing for smaller indie projects, and so usually budget is kind of the main barrier between me and getting to work with a live performer. I can work with friends, I can play it myself, but when that's not an option, I I've found it's difficult to sometimes sell the merits of having it, even just a live soloist to a developer when they're more on the coding or the game design side. I was curious if you as a composer or you guys as musicians have any sort of tips to how to sell the merits of getting a soloist on a soundtrack.
That's the easiest thing on the planet. Pay them yourself, and then send an MP3 that's the first 30 seconds without them, and then the second 30 seconds with them, and then ask for a reimbursement, and you'll get it. If you write it to play to the strengths of the musician, I mean, like I played on Journey, that's not doable any other way. Even though I'm using a lot of samples in that first version. And if I had to stick with just that, the score would have been much less orchestral because I would have been really focusing on using those live players, but you use them in a way that they're indispensable. And I just think, it's really not that much money at the end of the day, especially if it's just one person. You're going to be getting a relationship, and you say, look, we're investing in a long-term career together here. I may not be able to pay you scale on this one, but there's 50 more jobs coming after this if you're just willing to just help me out. I don't know a single musician that, again, we're all people. You have to remember that. As much as that seems weird to have to remind ourselves, it is that you develop these relationships, and then other times come along, and it's like, I got triple scale for you on this just simply because there was budget for it, and I'm happy to do it. And so I think, it's just bearing in mind that it's a big picture, lifelong voyage that you're on, and just bearing that in mind. But I think from a very pragmatic way to address your question, if you just do an A/B comparison of with and without them, if you're writing for them to well in a way that really features them, which is not terribly difficult to do as a solo, there's just no comparison. There's just no way they wouldn't see the value in it. Yeah. And then if not, you just give them my phone number and we'll talk about it.
Cool.
Sure.
Anything else? We're basically right on the clock here, so. All right, well, I'm sorry we didn't get to play some music, but I actually think this is much more valuable for you guys to be able to speak to these points. So thank you all so much. Don't forget the evaluations and blah, blah, blah.